about some very interesting weather patterns. Most people, when they hear the word Chinook, think of Calgary, Alberta, which is famous for its powerful winds, the elemental phenomenon caused by pressure changes on the lee side of the mountain. That's the technical description of what's happening in a Chinook, where in a clear sky, no storm at all, just howling winds race down the rocky face of mountains. I encountered winds sort of like that just 2 years ago in one of the windiest places of all Canada. I was on a bicycle trip around Cape Breton Island. I was going in the opposite direction to which most people go around the Cabot Trail, which meant that I was cycling back towards the mainland as I descended north in Mackenzie Mountains towards Cheticamp. And the wind that was coming off the Gulf as I tried to cycle that day was so powerful that I had to pedal down the side of the mountain. It was trying to push me back up. On the uphill portions, I sometimes was brought to a full stop and almost thrown off my bicycle, and eventually I had to get off and just push it in shame for fear that I was going to be destroyed by the wind. There were signs along this route that warned trucks that they might simply be blown over, not because of the speed they were traveling, but because of the speed of the wind. And all of this was happening on a sky that was blue and a sun that was shining down. And it's good reason for me to think that the winds encountered by Jesus' disciple as they made their way by boat to Bethsaida were this sort. Not a storm, but simply an enormous, tumultuous wind on a clear night. The story before us is one of the more famous stories of Jesus, and while it's our purpose to study the Gospel of John together, it will be helpful for us to draw on the telling of Matthew and Mark as well. In some cases, the synoptic Gospels, that's Matthew, Mark, Luke, in some cases the synoptics record an event that John records also, and there is question as to whether those are the same event. For example, the cleansing of the temple. I never try to harmonize John's telling of the cleansing of the temple, which happens at the beginning of Jesus' ministry in John, with the synoptic tellings, which happen during his final days in Jerusalem. I think it's two different cleansings of the temple. Also, when it comes to parables, I think if Jesus had a parable that he told once, he probably told that parable a dozen times, probably in every town and village he went to. And so it's not surprising that sometimes the synoptics in John will record some saying of Jesus, and they may vary, and I don't think we need to harmonize those. But in certain cases, and this is one of them, there's an event that happens, and it happens only once. And this event of Jesus walking on water very clearly happened only once. It's recorded by Matthew, by Mark, and by John. Luke doesn't record it. And as we look at it, I want to take a look at it because each one of them tells us something a little bit different. And since it's so rare that we make our way through an entire gospel account, it seems worth our time to consider this from three different angles. If you will, if somebody were shooting this as a movie, you'd have three different camera angles. John gives us that steady cam that's just sort of sitting there and taking in the action. And then we're going to go to Mark and we're going to get the wide angle view and see the entire horizon and landscape laid out before us. And then finally, we're going to get in with Matthew to the action cam, the close-up, that one that makes my dad sick and says, I can't watch movies like that. The camera's bouncing all over the place. So we're going to look at each one of these texts as we go along. And then as we conclude, I want to come back to John and conclude with what it is that John really wants to press upon us. So I'm going to invite you to open your Bibles to John chapter 6, and we'll read his telling of the story in a moment. All three accounts of the story agree, and this is why we know that there's just Well, there's a couple reasons why we know this event just happened once, but one is because all three agree that this is the event that happened the evening immediately following the feeding of the 5,000. The feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle recorded in all four Gospels other than the resurrection of Christ. And in three of the four Gospels, they follow the feeding of the 5,000 with this story of Jesus walking on water. But there's two things that John tells us that the synoptics don't record that are worth hearing. One of them comes from John chapter 6, verse 4, and we looked at it last time I was here. In John chapter 6, verse 4, we read this: "Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand." John's the only one that tells us when this happened, when the feeding of the 5,000 happened and the subsequent walking on water. Now I wonder, can you tell me what the night sky must look like at the time when the Passover, the Feast of the Jews, was at hand? What's the particular phenomenon that would mark Passover? You'd be very close to the full moon. Because Passover always happens, and if you wonder why it is Easter jumps all over on your calendar and Christmas always stays the same, it's because Passover is linked to when the Jews mark Easter is linked to when the Jews mark Passover, and they mark Passover based on a lunar calendar. It's on the 15th of Nisan, which is always a full moon, which is also why, this probably spoils some of those very popular Christian writers for you. The Christian writers that peddle in blood moons and talk about these weird phenomena. Why is it that so many things happen on a full moon? Well, of course they happen on a full moon. All of the Jewish feasts are tied to a lunar calendar. That's not coincidental. Anyways, I'll get down on a rabbit trail if I go down there. But I want to point out, and I think this is significant to this particular passage, that verse 4 tells us that the feast of Passover is near, and so the night sky above the Sea of Galilee is going to contain an almost full moon. That's one thing that John tells us. The other thing that John tells us, and he's the only one, comes from verse 15, which is the end of the story of the feeding of the 5,000. And this is what we read: "Perceiving then that they," that's the crowd, "were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself." Jesus knows that there's an impulse in this crowd, these 5,000 men, and because of this, he withdraws to the mountains. Where are his disciples as Jesus withdraws to the mountains? Well, you'll pick it up in the next camera angle. But let's carry on with John's account in verse 16. "When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea and got into a boat and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them." Let's look at that closely. When evening came, well, when does evening come? What does evening mean? If you hear the word evening, you're thinking of that period of time between late afternoon and night, probably the period around dusk or sunset. So when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea and got into the boat and started across the sea to Capernaum. And then it was now dark and Jesus had not come. Now, I did a little bit of research because I know you want to know. When does evening come? Around the 15th of Nisan, when the moon is full. Well, this is March or April, somewhere in those months, and the sun sets at the Sea of Galilee between 7 and 7:30 p.m. in those months. So we would presume that before it is yet dark, the disciples head down to the boat, but by the time they finally get underway, by the time they start moving out into the sea, darkness has fallen and Jesus has not come. And then verse 18 says, the sea, and I want you to see this word, the sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. Or, New American Standard, the sea began getting rough. Or, the New International, the sea grew rough. This is interesting because this tells me that when the disciples went down as the sun setting around 7:30 in the evening, and they got into the boat and Jesus hadn't yet come to them, the wind hadn't yet started to blow strongly. These guys are experienced mariners, and they maybe would have made a different decision if they had known how strong that wind was going to be. But they begin to make their way out, and as they begin to make their way, the sea begins to become rough because the winds begin to come. Verse 19, when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. Now, very likely this boat is rigged up with a sail, but they can't use it because the wind is blowing the wrong way. And so instead they are working hard at the oars. Now, I know you want to know the answer to this question. How fast can you row a boat? Well, I looked that up too. Hard to look up exactly the kind of boat they were in, so instead I looked up whaling boats. Whaling boats are fairly large, can hold enough people. Like a whaling boat would often have a crew of 6 to 10 and might even have 4 oars. And the whaling boats of the last century were able to be rowed at about 3 to 4 knots per hour, or 3.5 to 4.5 miles per hour. So here's the thought, where you come to church and you get to do math. You know, they have left at 7 to 7:30 in the evening. The sun is going down. They've begun to row. The wind starts to come up. The sea starts to get rough. They can't sail. They have to row. They're 3 to 4 miles out to sea, about 5.5, 6 kilometers out to sea. I wonder how long has it taken them to get that far? Well, if you can row 3 to 4 miles an hour, except that's 3 to 4 miles an hour in calm weather. You're going to hear a little bit more about that in a moment. And verse 20 says this, but he said to them, okay, so we're kind of jumping through this story right now. When they had rowed 3 to 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat. They were frightened, but he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at land to which they were going. I want you to hear Jesus' words to the disciples as he comes walking along on the sea. And as he's walking on the sea, they see him and they are frightened. You would be frightened. They are frightened. And he speaks to them and says, "It is I, do not be afraid." The literal words in the Greek for what he says are the same words that the Septuagint uses for when Moses encounters a burning bush in the wilderness. Literally, Jesus says, "I am. Don't be afraid." I am, don't be afraid. Now, those words, "I am," are correctly translated as we have it in our text, "It is I." That would be how you would say, "It is I." But given John's attention to the Exodus and his comparing Jesus' ministry to that event, and all through this story, he's telling us it's taking place in Passover. The next passage is coming into the discourse on the bread of life, where he's going to talk about manna in the wilderness. This picture is very much before the mind of John and his audience. It fits that he is following the Moses story, and that Jesus' words, "I am," are meant to have some weight with his disciples. To a terrified group in a rowboat, Jesus speaks these words, "I am, be not afraid." And John's account records that they receive him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the destination they were rowing for. And that's the whole story. And now, as good editors, we go back to the beginning and take a look at a totally different angle, the wide-angled lens, to see what Mark is going to show us. You'll find that in Mark chapter 6, verse 43. And don't worry, this is not going to sound too repetitive. This is how Mark concludes his story of the feeding of the 5,000. In verse 43, "And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces of the fish." We are beginning our filming with the same scene in the same moment the supper is over. And the disciples have gathered up their leftovers. They've got their little lunches to take back, their travel meals, if you will. And what happens next? Well, what does John tell us? John tells us something that nobody else tells us. John tells us that Jesus knew that it was the intention of the crowd to seize him as their king, and that he retreated to the mountains. But Mark doesn't tell us that. What does Mark tell us? Mark tells us this, verse 45. Immediately, he, that's Jesus, made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. Isn't that interesting? John says he knew that the crowd intended to seize him, and so he withdrew to the mountains. And Mark doesn't tell us that, but he tells us how the disciples get in the boat. He says immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side. What's the timing of these things? Well, obviously, Jesus can't withdraw from the crowd to the mountains before he sends his disciples and says, you guys, get in the boat and start heading for the other side. We're reading the same story, and it's easy to harmonize these two. John tells us that in the evening the men had gone down to the boat and they set off for the other side. Mark tells us that Jesus made the disciples go down and get in the boat and go to the other side. Why do you think he made them get in the boat? Well, I speculate a little bit here. But I wonder whose side do you think the disciples would have been on if they had gotten caught up in a crowd that said, let's make Jesus king now. I think Jesus should be our Messiah immediately. I think Jesus should reign over this regional kingdom of Israel, and he should be our temporal king and lead us against the Romans. Do you really think Peter and James and John, the sons of Boanerges, would be on Jesus' side when Jesus says, I'm not here for that reason? I think Jesus knows the disciples are going to be on the wrong side of this issue, so before any of that happens, he's like, you guys, go down and get in the boat right now. Take the food and go. I'll catch up with you later. And when evening came, verse 47, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. He meant to pass them by. Now, this is very interesting. Look at these words closely. The boat and the disciples are out at sea, and Mark says Jesus is alone on land. We know this. Jesus sends the disciples down, get in the boat, take the food, you got to go. Jesus knows what the crowd's intention is. He withdraws from them. Mark tells us he goes up on the mountain, and when he goes up on the mountain, he goes up on the mountain to pray. And it says the disciples are out on the sea, and Jesus is alone on land. Now, how far out to sea are they? Well, Mark doesn't tell us, but John does. Mark doesn't give us distance, he gives us time. He tells us that it's about the fourth watch of the night. Now I know, Robin, you want to know, what is the fourth watch of the night? Well, the Romans divided the night into 4 watches. The fourth watch begins at 3 a.m. and goes on till 6 a.m. So we know that they get in around twilight, 7 to 7:30 p.m. We know that when Jesus saw them, they were struggling against what does he call it? They were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And it's the fourth watch of the night. So here's what we know is, taking a conservative estimate, from 7 p.m. till the earliest this could be, or the earliest this could be is 3 a.m. That's 8 hours. Now, if you're supposed to be able to row a boat at 4 miles an hour, should take 2 hours to cross the sea by rowing. But they've only gone 4 miles in 8 hours, so we even know their speed. They're going half a mile an hour. This is painful progress. These guys are struggling. Now here's the really interesting thing. Why does Mark say Jesus is still on land alone, the disciples are at sea, it's the fourth watch of the night, that's 8 hours after they've left, and Jesus saw them? We know they're 4 miles out to sea. Well, I find this fascinating. You know, you go, oh boy, it's 2:30 in the afternoon. This is a lot of math, But I find this fascinating, because how does Jesus see them 4 miles out at 3 o'clock in the morning? Well, we got a full moon shining. We got a Chinook wind blowing. We don't have a cloud cover. Jesus is up on the side of a mountain, and he's looking down. And in this whole sea, there's nobody out there at 3 o'clock in the morning. Nobody's crazy enough to go out in this kind of gale. But there's his disciples, and they're taking turns at the oars, and they're sweating buckets, and they're tired, and they're probably a little bit miserable, because anytime you've been rowing a boat for 8 hours and you're only halfway across the sea, it's just not a happy day. And so Jesus sees them, and I suspect that perhaps when Jesus sent them off, and this brings into question foreknowledge, but let's not worry too much about that perhaps Jesus' intention was, you guys go across by boat, that at least, let's say this, the disciples must have presumed that Jesus' intention was just to walk around the Sea of Galilee, which would only take him about 6 hours to walk to Bethsaida. It would take them 2 hours to row there. It would take him 6 hours to walk around. He'll meet him before lunch the next day, no problem. Whatever Jesus knew his intention was, that's what the disciples presumed. And this is why I say this is the wide-angled view, because he's up on the mountain looking down, sees the little boat there, like this, the moon's shining down, the winds are blowing, the guys are sweating. I wish Jesus had come with us. It probably would have been better. And Jesus, it says here, when he saw them, and he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. About the fourth watch of the night, he came to them. Love that. These guys are in some trouble. They're not getting anywhere. I guess I'll go out there to them. And he comes to them walking on the sea. And he meant to pass them by, but, this verse 49, when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. Same thing that John tells us, more or less. Jesus shows up, they're terrified. Mark tells us why they're terrified. These guys have heard too many ghost stories, and they're like, there's a ghost, it's a phantom, it's a spectral image, who knows who that is? And Jesus says, "Take heart, I am, don't be afraid." And he gets into the boat, the winds cease, and they reach their destination. Which leaves us only one camera to view. And that is that close-up camera that'll make you sick because it jiggles all over the place, that Matthew's holding so he can get all the action. Matthew and Mark share the same beginning of the story. You'll find this story in Matthew 14, verse 22. They both confirm that Jesus is insistent that the disciples not tarry or hang about. He makes them get into the boat. Verse 22 of Matthew 14, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat by this time was a long way from land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth night of the watch, he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the ghost, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." All these details match. We've heard this story 3 times now. Jesus has dismissed the crowd. He goes up on the mountain alone to pray. The wind is against the boat. Matthew tells us that the waves are beating against the boat. That makes sense. A strong wind is going to bring big waves. I believe that the evidence here is pointing to a wind and wave event with a clear moonlit sky, because Jesus sees them 4 miles out, struggling against the wind. It's nearing the wee hours of the morning when the disciples catch sight of the ghostly figure walking towards them. They're terrified. They hear the familiar voice of Jesus speaking to them, "Take heart, I am, do not be afraid." But now we get one more close-up detail that nobody else includes. And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Now, I want to ask 2 questions here. One is the one you've been asking all the way along. You wanted me to ask this question, and I will. How is it possible for Jesus to walk on water? What's that all about? And then two, this particular angle brings this question. Is Peter a man of courageous faith? And is that what this story is meant to teach us? You know, the skeptics scoff at this story. The liberals come up with some really bizarre naturalistic explanations that don't solve anything. Everything from as crazy as fast-forming ice to a reef that Jesus knows where it is, but Peter doesn't, to the most zany of them all, which is that the boat has decided to skirt the edge of the lake and Jesus is actually walking on the shore, and the disciples are just a few feet off and he's having this conversation. None of those really bear very much water. So we come to the question of physics, and I have no interest in speculating on physics at 2:30 in the afternoon, but this is enough for me, that if you were to tell the disciples, hey, we can put 300 people inside a metal tube and fly them at 35,000 feet for 20 hours across to the other side of the world where they're going to land safely and think this routine and collect their luggage and go off to adventure in Australia. And they would say, you out of your mind. How can you put 300 people inside a metal tube and it's going to fly? That's crazy. It was based on something they didn't understand yet, but we do it all the time. In fact, some of you have flown to Australia, and almost everybody's flown somewhere in a metal tube, and you actually think it routine, and you don't even think it's marvelous anymore. And yet, the ancients would have thought, that's crazy. I say that because I believe that what Jesus did here is based on some law of nature that if it doesn't exist currently, will exist. That it's a miracle of an age yet to come. Now, here I'm going to give a little tiny bit of conjecture. Just a little bit of conjecture, and I think I've got some reason for this conjecture, but you can take it and leave it, okay? Here's my conjecture. I think that Jesus does this, and that this is an act that is related to his divinity, but is particularly related to his role as the second Adam. I think that what Jesus does here is meant to show us what Adam probably would have been able to do had the fall not come. Now that is conjecture, but I think Alfred Edersheim helps me out here a little bit. Alfred Edersheim speculates that in Adam's dominion over creation, including the seas, that it would have been God's intention that there would have been some physics that would exist that would allow man to walk on the water. And the other reason I have for that, and the one that gives me a little bit of strength on this, is if it was simply based on God can do this, but man cannot, and Jesus is the Son of God, so he can walk on water, how does Peter walk on water? It's conjecture. You can take it or leave it, but I suspect the day will come in the final new heavens and new earth where we won't think anything of walking across Lake Erie, just as we don't think anything about flying 35,000 feet in the air in a metal tube. I might be wrong. So that leads me to the second question, and I've got more authority to speak on the second question than the first question. How does Jesus walk on water? I don't know. But I don't have any doubts about that. That's God working out his own world. Is this a courageous act of faith on the part of Peter? That's how the Sunday school version of this goes, right? The Sunday school version of this story says, what a guy Peter is. All the other disciples are afraid. Peter hears it, and he's courageous and bold and steps out, and he walks on water. And we end up commending Peter for something that Jesus actually rebukes Peter for in about 5 minutes' time. Because this is not an act of courageous faith by Peter. This is equal parts doubt and presumption on Peter's part. I hate to destroy your Sunday school illusions. When Jesus approaches the disciples and they're afraid, he identifies himself, I am, don't be afraid. And Peter's response to Jesus' statement, it is I, don't be afraid, is, if it's really you, if that's really you, Jesus, that's the doubt part, here comes the presumption, command me to come to you on the water. It's doubt and presumption, equal parts. It's not faith, it's at least less than faith, because it's saying, well, I need evidence. I need proof. Prove that it's you. I'm going to risk my life on this one. And Jesus says to him, come. Verse 29, so Peter got out of the boat, walked in the water, came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me! And Jesus immediately reached out his hand, took hold of him, saying, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? So, Peter is equal parts doubt and presumption. And Jesus responds with mercy to both the doubt and the presumption. To the doubt, Jesus gives the answer, come. Peter, you doubt that it's me? I will prove that it's you. Get out and walk on the water. Come to me. Jesus is graciously showing some mercy to Peter and saying, I will satisfy the doubt that you're feeling by proving that it's me. But Jesus also mercifully deals with the presumption. Presumption is asking for what we have no right to ask for. And he deals with Peter's presumption by not taking away any of Peter's fears. So as Peter starts walking, and all of a sudden you're like, hey, you know what? This walking on water isn't as easy as Jesus makes it look. The waves are going up and down. The wind's going all over the place. And Peter looks at the wind, sees the waves, and down he goes. He's into the water, and he cries out the only phrase that Peter says in this whole scenario that you should repeat for yourself is, Lord, save me! And Jesus reaches down, grabs him, pulls him up, and Jesus says to him, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? And I wonder, and you should wonder, did he ask him that question about the first doubt or the second doubt? Did he ask him about the first wave of doubt that carried him out of the boat or the second wave of doubt that plunged him into the sea? I think both. It's like, Peter, why did you doubt? If you had just trusted me and stayed in the boat, you wouldn't be wet right now. And if when you got out of the boat, you trusted me, you wouldn't be wet right now. But Peter, you need a change of clothes. And when they got into the boat, verse 32, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. It is the disciples' response to this act that leads them to worship. And that leads me to a final application. I said we would come back a little bit to John and finish up with John. You remember Moses? Particularly Moses of the middle years, Moses in Midian, Moses before he's called to lead the children of Israel, before he comes with plagues upon Pharaoh, before he raises his rod and the waters open and the people go out in dry land. Moses of the middle years in Midian. Moses, the failed middle-aged guy who actually tried to deliver his people in his own strength, had knocked down an Egyptian, killed him because he was beating an Israelite, and thought that this would maybe be the wave that would carry them to freedom, and it didn't. Everything went wrong. In fact, he had to flee. And you know, he spent 40 years as a shepherd in Midian. I think he probably spent 40 years kind of wondering, am I a failure? After all he'd done? After all he'd attempted to deliver the Hebrews by his own power? This is not what he had expected. And yet, there's a day there in Midian, in the middling years of Moses, when he looks and he sees a burning bush. And the bush is burning but not consumed, and he draws close to see what's going on. And the voice speaks to him and says, Moses, take off your sandals. The ground you're standing on is holy ground. And he is afraid. And the voice speaks to him from the bush, and it says, I am. I am who I am. And then God sends Moses to deliver the people of Israel. It's not the timing that Moses would have chosen for that. 40 years of middling existence as a middle-aged failure in Midian leading sheep is not the timing that Moses would have chosen, and it's not the method he would have chosen, but I want you to see that the I am shows up. The I am comes. You remember Job? Job, when he has lost his health and his wealth, and worst of all, his children, and is surrounded by miserable comforters who are accusing him of things that he hasn't done, and he feels forsaken and abandoned by God. He's diseased and in deep depression. But even Job recognizes that God has enormous power. In fact, the act of walking on water by Jesus matches almost word for word what Job says of God in Job chapter 9, verse 8, when he says that the Lord is the one who alone stretched out the heavens and treads the waves of the sea. God is the one who treads the waves of the sea, says Job, even in his misery. Job's answer didn't come when he asked for it, and it wasn't the answer he thought he would receive. But I want you to see in the story of Job that the I am shows up. There's 12 men in a boat struggling at the oars all night long. Must have felt a little bit abandoned by Jesus. He could have come with them in the boat. He didn't have to insist they get in the boat and row it all by themselves. But here they are, the fourth watch of the night, going half a mile per hour, straining at the oars, wondering if Jesus would save them. And then unexpectedly, in a way that they would never have anticipated, he's there. I am. Do not be afraid. Why does John include this story? Know this, my sister, my brother, that there is no force on earth that can compete with the power of God. Not the wind, not the waves, not the situations that are swirling in your life. You have been long at the oars, perhaps. The winds seem to howl, the waves batter your bark. But in His time, without a doubt, the great I am will come. And when He does, let me say this, don't doubt, don't test, just look at Him. Say, Lord, save me. Heavenly Father, Lord, I thank You for the story that is here. Lord, I thank You for the way that it echoes throughout the Scripture. Lord, that we see over and over again that Your timing is not the same as our timing. That Your plans are often not anything like our plans. And yet, Lord, those who trust in You are not put to shame. And so, Father, for the one today who is struggling, who feels abandoned, who is wondering at Your timing, I pray, Father, that You might use this story to give them that extra bit of courage they need, Lord, not to do something foolish like try to walk on water themselves, but rather to trust that You are who You say You are, and that Your promises are sure, and that You will show up. And Lord, for these things we thank You. In Jesus' name.